that you've all been picking up over there is Outcast, our friend John Matteson. And once again, I will read, just to make sure I get everything in here. An associate professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, and litigation attorney, which I really think is an interesting path from litigation attorney to Louisa.
I have not fired off a legal brief in anger in about 15 years.
It's a great path, though. I think it's wonderful. John received his BA in history from Princeton, a PhD in English from Columbia, a law degree from Harvard. So I don't know. Do you think he can study? John currently teaches literature and legal writing, has published articles and book chapters on a variety of 19th century Americans, including Herman Melville, William James, and Louisa May Alcott. His first full-length book, Eden's Outcast, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father, will be published, but we have the advanced copies from W.W. Norton. Woo-hoo! Yes! You're here. And we are very happy to have John and
I have a colleague at my college, at John Jay, who from time to time takes it upon himself to give me career advice. And, terrific, okay. And unlike most people who give free advice, he's correct more often than he's wrong. But I want to share with you one instance in which he was mistaken. When I first arrived at John Jay and was figuring out what I was going to write for my first book, he took me aside and said, "John, I want you to be aware that you are going to hate writing your first book." And I just thought everyone hates it. That's not true. It certainly was not true for me. In fact, the process of writing this book has been phenomenal. A journey of self-discovery, and one just strewn with blessings, and particularly in those people whom I've met along the way. Many of you gathered today in this room. I cannot thank you all enough for the help that you've given me. When I came into Concord 2 days ago, and I drove in, interestingly enough, Beethoven's Ode to Joy was playing on and life doesn't always provide such great coincidences, so it was really terrific. And it is really a joy for me always to come to Concord, to come particularly to Orchard House, and to return to a place that I've come to know well, which I always wish to know better than I already do. And every conversation series I've been to thus far, successively, has been my favorite one, and this year, no exception. It's just been sensational. And so anyway, Jan, I have a little bit of a surprise for you. This copy of Eden's Outcast was actually the first completed, finished one that I saw, and it was placed in my hands by Jan just yesterday morning, and she took pictures and stuff. It was wonderful. But I want you to know that this is the only time that I would be reading aloud from this particular copy, because what I've been doing surreptitiously is going around and getting all of the presenters to sign this to give Jan back to you. And so anyway, everyone who has presented up to now has signed it. Sarah also has signed it. I will track down Lisa and Sandy tomorrow. So, well, the pleasure is mine, and the inscription is for Jan Turnquist, who has made Orchard House an Eden of its own. So anyway, I have a book to read from, and I tried to put a lot of thought into what portions I was going to read, and I probably completely messed it up, and I may not be reading from the parts that the episodes in the Alcott's story that you may have most been wanting to hear. I really don't know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a portion of the chapter that deals with the near breakup of the family during the Fruitlands communal experiment. And then after that, I'll be reading something from the time that Louisa, immediately after turning 30, goes off to war as a Civil War nurse. Time permitting after that, I'd like to read some of the pages from the very end, but we'll see how that goes.
You'll take the time.
Okay.
We want you to.
Very good. So I'm with both of these readings. I'll be picking up in medias res, in the middle of the chapter. But if there's anything that needs explaining, by all means ask questions, and we'll get it all figured out. And hang on just for a second. My eyes were much better when I started writing this book than they are now, so I can be very grandfatherly now. Okay. Circumstances were urging Bronson toward a crisis. Fruitlands had consumed virtually all his and Lane's earthly resources. If they went back to the life they had left behind, they would be destitute. Then there was the opinion of others to consider. If Fruitlands collapsed, who would again believe in the chance of a virtuous life on Earth? In the late autumn of 1843, this question was causing Bronson Alcott to think very hard. In search of his soul, he had rejected much of the world. Perhaps what he required was one final great renunciation. Bronson's idea that he could save himself and his colony only by leaving his wife and daughters may have been partly inspired by the book that had dominated his formative years, The Pilgrims Progress. At the beginning of Bunyan's allegory, the central figure, Christian, has a premonition that his city is soon to be destroyed by fire from heaven. Shaken by this intuition, he urges his wife and 4 children to join him in fleeing from the peril. However, his family cannot understand his strange preoccupation, and their hearts harden against him. Christian begins to run. When his wife and sons cry after him to come back, Christian, quote, put his fingers in his ears and ran on crying, life, life, eternal life. So he looked not behind him, but fled towards the middle of the plain. Bunyan's advice seems clear. No worldly attachment, not even the pleas of one's own astonished family, must stand between a person and salvation. Unlike Bunyan's pilgrims, Bronson had loved his wife and daughters enough to take them with him on his flight from a wicked world. Now, however, it seemed clear to him that the path of the soul must be individual. The person who was forced continually to pause and consider the wants and welfare of dependents would never have the focus and peace of mind that were the preconditions of enlightenment. Seeing no other way to preserve his ideal, Alcott decided that Charles Lane must be right. If there were to be a Fruitlands at all, there must be one for men and another for women. To his distraught mind, dissolving the Alcott family seemed the only way to save it. For Abba's part, she too was confronting the possibility that loyalty to her marriage might be the swiftest road to ruin. The shortage of fuel and foodstuffs, as well as the illnesses that were breaking out amongst the group, were daunting omens for the coming winter. Matters of moral salvation and family unity were yielding precedence to the starker question of mere survival. Abba had also begun to question the basic wholesomeness of the consociate ideal. Bronson and Lane had always been noticeably imprecise about the sexual arrangements that would prevail among the ideal universal family, and now Abba seems to have begun to worry about this unanswered question. She confided to her brother Samuel that she could see, quote, no clean, healthy, safe course here in connection with Mr. L, unquote. To another brother, she wrote enigmatically, quote, I am not dead yet, either to life or love, but the last few weeks have been filled with experiences of the deepest interest to me and my family, unquote. The precise meaning of these words cannot be deciphered. Perhaps Lane had decided that the spirit of community extended to the bedroom and was arguing for conjugal privileges. No less likely, given Lane's high regard for all forms of self-denial, he was urging Bronson and Abba to abstain from relations with each other. Whether or not Bronson's chastity was an issue, Abba plainly feared for his sanity. For her, the Fruitlands experiment was becoming too physically perilous and too emotionally strange to continue much longer. No matter how much she loved her husband, and no matter how bleak the prospects for a woman of her time who left her husband, Abba was perhaps almost as ready for a parting as Bronson. The precise terms upon which Bronson contemplated dividing the family are unclear. Perhaps it was suggested that the Lanes and Alcotts would merge into the Shaker community. Perhaps Bronson meant for his wife and daughters to decamp entirely, leaving him and Lane to reconstruct Fruitlands as a sort of single-sex monastery. I should pause just to explain the reference to the Shakers. Directly across the river from Fruitlands, there was a thriving Shaker community. And of course, as you may know, the Shakers believed in the segregation of the sexes. And if you even so much as had to speak with someone of the opposite sex, you were not permitted to do so unless you had a chaperone present. And Lane, being the sexually abstemious but also somewhat strange man that he was, thought that this might really be a good way to go. So that's why the Shakers fit into this. Absorption into the Shakers would have obliterated the conceptual foundations of Alcott's vision. It is inconceivable that Lane and Alcott might have converted the Shakers to vegetarianism, or that the Shakers would have willingly cast aside Mother Ann Lee, founder of the Shakers, in favor of Father Bronson. As for requiring Abba and the girls to depart, one wonders how Alcott and Lane would have lasted the winter, having sent their only remaining workforce into exile. There was, moreover, a peculiar irony in asking the women to leave for the supposed good of the community. When the other members of the commune had departed, and Lane and Alcott had impulsively gone off on their pilgrimages, Abba and her daughters had been the Fruitlands community. This fact, however, was evidently not in Bronson's mind on November 20th, the date when Louisa's journal first mentions the possibility of a separation. November 20th was a busy day for Louisa. She awoke at 5, washed the breakfast dishes, and then helped her mother with the rest of the work. In the afternoon, she looked after Abby May so that her mother could concentrate on her chores. Since Ada was visiting relatives in Boston, Louisa probably had more to do than usual, yet she still had time to make some things for her doll in the evening. She relates what happened next in matter-of-fact language. After a talk with Lane, Bronson consulted Abbott and Louisa, asking if they saw any reason to separate. Louisa added, quote, "Mother wanted to. She is so tired. I like it, but not the school part, or Mr. L." Unquote. The tensions in the farmhouse continued without resolution for 3 more weeks. During that time, on a snowy day, Louisa turned 11, and her father 44. Bronson's preoccupation with the moral improvement of his children did not take a holiday, however. In the evening, he quizzed them as to the fault that troubled each of them most. Louisa named her bad temper, and no one seems to have disagreed. But even as Bronson emphasized self-restraint, Abba spoke up for the other pillar of Alcott girlhood, self-expression. Abba wrote a note to Louisa praising her diary, and Louisa proudly copied the little missive into her journal. I like to have you make observations about our conversations and your own thoughts. It helps you to express them and to understand your little self. Remember, dear girl, that a diary should be an epitome of your life. May it be a record of pure thought and good actions. Then you will indeed be the precious child of your loving mother. All the pure thoughts and good actions Louisa could muster did not forestall the inevitable crisis. Even as the family celebrated the double birthday, Lane wrote to Oldham, one of his colleagues still in England, that Abba had seized control of the situation. She had informed him that, in response to the wishes of her friends, she had determined to, quote, withdraw to a house which they will provide for herself and her 4 children, unquote. Moreover, she proposed to take the furniture with her. Yeah.
Only just.
Right. A gesture that would, as Lane put it, leave me alone and naked in the new world.
Oh.
I know, poor Charles. Apparently, Abba and Bronson kept the extent of their differences from the children for several weeks. The silence was finally broken barely 2 weeks before Christmas. Charles Lane was not present. Perhaps he had seen a tempest in the making and thought it best not to be nearby. Nevertheless, he was having an unpleasant trip. In Concord, he was arrested for having refused to pay his taxes. When he declined to call on any friend to answer for him, the authorities had no choice but to put him in jail. There he languished for a short time until a local Samaritan paid the arrearage. Coming home from a visit to Margaret Fuller in Boston, Emerson found Lane waiting for him, looking, quote, sad and indisposed, unquote. On December 10th, in the most anguished entry of her Fruitlands journal, Louisa wrote of a family meeting. In the evening, after another reading from the Pilgrims Progress, Bronson assembled Abba and his two older daughters for a talk. Louisa did not record exactly what was said, but what she did write was telling enough. Quote, I was very unhappy, and we all cried. Anna and I cried in bed, and I prayed to God to keep us all together. Unquote. Neither Louisa the girl nor Louisa the grown woman made frequent mention of God in her journals. She did not often, quote, pray in words, unquote, and she almost never divulged the content of her prayers. Now, however, as her earthly father threatened to withdraw, she called desperately upon her Father in heaven. 7 months earlier, she had been led to believe that family was everything. She had been asked to accept the notion that her own father was so exceptionally wise and loving that he could be not only her father, but the sire of an entire community of work, devotion, and love. Now that father, who had seemed equal to any challenge, seemed capable of any betrayal. Her mother, she knew, would still do all within her power, but on a December night, in a lonely place, that power seemed small indeed. Louisa could not confidently look to her parents for security, and she was only 11 years old. The answer to Louisa's prayers lay with her father. Bronson Alcott had been driven to the most important decision he would ever make. He was being asked to choose irrevocably what he was going to live for. If he renounced his family and strove on alone, he might at last discover the God of his imaginings. But if he did so, he would always know that he had betrayed perhaps an even greater trust. He would be deserting the wife whom he had cherished and who had selflessly adopted his ideals as her own. Still worse, he would turn his back on the 4 little girls whom he had tried to acquaint with the beauty and perfection of their souls. He would never finish the work of teaching them how to love, share, and make brave choices. And the final example he would have set for them would be a lesson in human faithlessness and self-absorption. He could achieve the transcendence he sought only by committing a selfish sin, while the sinful world held forth the trust and love of others. 7 months earlier, when he brought his family to Fruitlands, Bronson had supposed that he could both separate himself from the world and take its dearest aspects with him. Now that attempt to have the best of both had failed. He had to decide who he really was. He did not decide immediately, and no surviving writing illuminates the process by which he chose. At Christmas, Abba sang and played with the children, trying to cheer them as the snows mounted outside the door. Bronson, however, was in Boston, attending a convention devoted to some obscure reform. During this trip, evidently, he reached his decision. The world and the family had won. On January 1st, 1844, a day for new beginnings, Bronson returned from Boston. Though it is not clear precisely when or how he broached the news of his decision, it soon became understood that he would not be a consociate, but an Alcott. To ease their hardships, the family decided to accept an offer to move in with a local family, the Lovejoys, until spring. Abba wrote in her diary with obvious relief that, quote, all connections with Fruitlands, unquote, had been dissolved. The response to Bronson's decision was predictably mixed. Lane, disappointed with what he saw as the triumph of his partner's weak, uxorious nature, packed his bags. On January 6th, he and his son William left to live with the Shakers. 5 days later, Abba exulted in a letter to her brother Samuel, quote, all Mr. Lane's efforts have been to disunite us, but Mr. Alcott's conjugal and paternal instincts were too strong for him. Unquote. But the accumulated weight of the preceding months, the unrelenting toil, the continual moral self-examination, the gradual defection of his followers, and finally the near collapse of his family had almost crushed Bronson. Not long after Lane's exodus, before his own journey to the Lovejoy home could take place, Bronson climbed the stairs at the Fruitlands farmhouse, lay down on his bed, and turned away from the door. There he lay, the prey of dark reflections. He did not stir. He refused to eat. It is generally assumed that he had decided to die. Then, on the edge of despair, a change occurred. In her story, Transcendental Wild Oats, Louisa wrote nothing of the debate over whether her family would separate. However, she wrote long, poignant paragraphs about the days when her father lay silent, teetering between life and death, sanity and madness. These paragraphs are fiction, but they are the only account of those transformative hours by someone who observed them. For good reason, modern biographers of Bronson have rarely been able to resist quoting them at length. So along comes a rather long quotation, please indulge. Then this dreamer, whose dream was the life of his life, resolved to carry out his idea to the bitter end. There seemed no place for him here, no work, no friend. Silently he lay down upon his bed, turned his face to the wall, and waited with pathetic patience for death to cut the knot which he could not untie. Days and nights went by, and neither food nor water passed his lips. Soul and body were dumbly struggling together, and no word of complaint betrayed what either suffered. But the strong angels who sustain and teach perplexed and troubled souls came and went, leaving no trace without, but working miracles within. For when all other sentiments had faded into dimness, all other hopes died utterly, when the bitterness of death was nearly over, when body was past any pang of hunger or thirst, and soul stood ready to depart, the love that outlives all else refused to die. Head had bowed to defeat, but heart could not grow cold who lived in its tender depths. And this is a quotation within a quotation of Bronson's thoughts. My faithful wife, my little girls, they have not forsaken me. They are mine by ties that none can break. What right have I to leave them alone? What right to escape from the burden and sorrow I have helped to bring? This duty remains to me, and I must do it manfully. For their sakes, the world will forgive me in time. For their sakes, God will sustain me now. Too feeble to rise, he groped for the food. This is still from Louisa. Too feeble to rise, he groped for the food that always lay within his reach. And in the darkness and solitude of that memorable night, ate and drank what was to him the bread and wine of a new communion, a new dedication of heart and life to the duties that were left him when the dreams fled. In the early dawn, when that sad wife crept fearfully to see what change had come to the patient face on the pillow, she found it smiling at her, saw a wasted hand outstretched to her, and heard a feeble voice cry bravely, "Hope." And that's the end of the quotation from Louisa. You're now back to me. Not long after the end of Fruitlands, Bronson wrote about the difference between success and failure. A man failed, he thought, quote, when his idea ruins him, when he is dwarfed and killed by it, unquote. Success, on the other hand, meant using one's ideas as a means of growing. It also meant staying true to one's vision, regardless of the world's opinion. To succeed, therefore, was a matter of choice. Looking back on her father's recovery, Louisa wanted very much to observe it as a resurrection. She represented it as the death of her quixotic communalist father and the birth of a new man, redeemed by family, cured of delusion, and tenderly consecrated to the welfare of the blood relations who had called him back from the abyss. However, real lives rarely divide so neatly, and neither did Bronson's. When Orchid emerged from his sick room, wan and harrowed by his ordeal, no one denied that he was a changed man. But what precisely was the nature of his transformation? If the experience left him more dedicated to his own family, this change required more time than the 7 months at Fruitlands to complete itself. Indeed, 9 months after the fall of his community, Bronson wrote to his brother Junius of his hopes to found another utopian society. Emerson, he said, had offered to give him a few acres and build him a house, and Samuel May had volunteered backing that would free him from the pressures of rents and landlords. Bronson meant to use the space to erect dwellings for several families, of which he imagined he would become the super patriarch. He wrote, quote, "I cannot consent to live solely for one family. I would stand in neighborly relations to several and institute a union and communion of families instead of drawing aside within the precincts of one's own acres and kindred by blood." Bronson's idealism had passed through his trials unaltered. What had changed was the measure of his ambition and energy. There was to be no second communion of families, not because Alcott could no longer dream, but because his will was spent and broken. Despite his protestations, he would eventually consent to live for one family, to till one garden, to strive for the reform and perfection of one spirit, his own. Though his desires remained qualitatively the same, he gradually their scope to the realm of the possible. Tucked away among the Alcott family papers is a copy of a drawing of unstated origin, at the bottom of which can be read the handwritten caption, quote, "Removing from Fruitlands, Jan 1844. And in the snow-covered scene, a team of oxen stands before a sled, crowded almost to capacity with 9 human figures. Either this is an exaggeration, since by the time of this last departure, only the Alcott family remained on the premises, or the other figures are friends who have come to help the family vacate. In the background, the farmhouse sits among a grove of bare trees. Curiously, there is still smoke rising from the chimney. In the middle ground, a bearded figure, evidently Joseph Palmer, who was a man from a nearby place, curiously called No Town, who he never joined the commune, but was kind enough to lend his efforts, and he took over after the Alcotts left. But anyway, in the middle ground, a bearded figure, evidently Joseph Palmer, applies a shovel to the cold earth, still determined to extract something of value from the ruined venture. Just being helped over the stile so she can board the wagon is a grown woman, presumably Abba. All the people in the sled appear drained of energy, but those who wear a visible expression at all appear to be smiling, perhaps with relief. Only 2 figures appear cross and discontented. The oxen are openly scowling, as if they somehow know that the experiment whose end they are witnessing has been for their benefit and will never be tried again. One would expect Bronson himself to figure prominently in the picture. Strange to say, it is difficult to guess even which of the figures he is meant to be. Although the family had found a place for the winter, its future was no more certain than ever. As they made their slow and frigid way to the Lovejoys, the world that lay before them bore no clear features. They had survived a test to their unity. Now, unity was all they had. So that's the conclusion of that chapter. I will now fast forward and bring you to the autumn of 1862. The Civil War has been underway for almost a year and a half. Henry David Thoreau has just passed away, and I pick up a few months before Louisa makes her decision to go off to war.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
How old was Louisa when she wrote that diary entry? Because that sounds like tremendous writing.
When she wrote the
One that you just read.
Okay, well, the diary entries she was writing at age 11. The long excerpt that I read to you is from a story called Transcendental Wild Oats, which she wrote as a fully fledged adult. I think, and our panel of experts in help, 1873? Thereabouts? Okay, everyone's nodding, so I guess I'm right.
Those sound like terrific words for 11-year-olds.
Yeah. Well, she had very much come into her style at that point. In fact, something that to me is very interesting, people talk about the absence of the Bronson figure from Little Women. One of the explanations for that is that Louisa, when she was writing Little Women, was actively contemplating writing a book in which Bronson would be essentially the central character, called The Cost of an Idea. And Transcendental Wild Oats was basically a sketch that she wrote in support of that project, which was never completed. And so anyway, I've always thought that she didn't want to expend all of her great material on Bronson while she was writing Little Women. She was saving it for a book that unfortunately never came to be. So anyway, okay. As the war entered, it's actually summer rather than autumn, I'm sorry. As the war entered its second summer, Whatever anguish Bronson initially felt about its violence was giving way to his irresistible need to idealize. It was a tendency that people who had seen the war firsthand were likely to find absurd. Fresh from her brilliant literary debut, Life in the Iron Mills, Rebecca Harding Davis came to Concord to meet Hawthorne. At the wayside, she attended a dinner party with Alcott and Emerson that dimmed her view of transcendentalism in general and Alcott in particular. Before dinner, Alcott stood in front of the fireplace in Hawthorne's small parlor, proclaiming the war, quote, an armed angel, awakening the nation to a lofty life unknown before, unquote. Waving his hands like the conductor of a one-man orchestra, he chanted his praise of the rifle and the sword raised in a righteous cause. Davis, who came from Wheeling, Virginia, and was no great enemy of slavery, took quiet offense to Alcott's words and their, quote, strained high note of exaltation, unquote. She later wrote, I had just come up from the border where I had seen the actual war, the filthy spewings of it, the political jobbery, the malignant personal hatreds wearing patriotic masks and glutted by burning homes and outraged women. We could still use her, couldn't we? War may be an armed angel with a mission, but she has the personal habits of the slums. Hawthorne, according to Davis, wore a look of mockery as he sat backward astride a chair listening to Alcott's monologue. At last he said gravely, we cannot see this thing at so long a range, and he quietly conducted the party into the dining room. Earlier in the day, Hawthorne had warned Davis about Alcott's obsession with vegetarianism. You may begin at Plato or the day's news, Hawthorne told his guest, and he will come around to pears. He is now convinced that pears exercise a more direct and ennobling influence on us than any other vegetable or fruit. By the end of the meal, Alcott did indeed announce the spiritual influence of pears, and Hawthorne laughed aloud to see his prediction come true. Yet, although Davis thought him ridiculous, Alcott remained more sensitive to the sufferings of war than she knew. When he read the accounts of Antietam that September, the old feelings of helplessness and pity came back. He wrote, what can one do but read the news and weep at our victories even? For Louisa, a supreme test of confidence was drawing near. It was hastened perhaps by the news that Anna and John were expecting their first child, another sign that time was passing. At 25, Louisa would later write in Little Women, girls begin to talk about being old maids, but secretly will resolve that they never will. At 30, they say nothing about it, but quietly accept the fact. Louisa was to turn 30 on November 29, 1862. She had no interest in quietly accepting the fact. The notation in her journal for that month, quote, 30 years old, decide to go to Washington as a nurse if I could find a place, unquote, illustrates that the birthday and her redoubled desire to break out of old patterns were no coincidence. Uninterested in enlisting dewy-eyed young women, heeding the call of romance instead of duty, Dorothea Dix, the head of the Union's nursing corps, had publicly announced that she would consider no applicants under 30. Louisa had heard good reports of the facilities at the Armory Square Hospital in Washington. She hoped to rely on Hannah Stevenson, who had found Louisa a job in the aftermath of the latter's brush with suicide, and who wielded some influence with the necessary authorities. Louisa sent in her name, and as she awaited a reply, made ready for a great change. Louisa received her orders on the morning of December 11th. She had not been assigned to the Armory Square, but to a less desirable institution in Georgetown, known as the Union Hotel Hospital, a place Louisa learned to refer to in jest as the Hurly-Burly House. Louisa was to report for duty as soon as possible, and the rest of that Thursday was spent in a whirl of activity. Abba, Anna, and May, back from Syracuse, all helped to stuff Louisa's traveling bag with all there was of home that such a bag could carry. Sophia Hawthorne looked in to see whether she could help. There were too many hands for the necessary tasks. Someone remembered to put tea out, but in the confusion, put in salt instead of sugar. Bronson was away that day making school visits. For all the documents show, he and Louisa may not even have had a chance to say goodbye. Proud as he was of his daughter's decision, he also knew that she was going to a dangerous post. He told someone that he was sending his only son to war. Louisa was equally aware that she might never see the family again. She maintained a brave face until the very last, but when it was time to go, she began to cry. Everyone broke down. Already knowing the answer, she asked her mother as she held her close, "Shall I stay?" "No, go, and the Lord be with you," was the reply. As Louisa turned to catch a last glimpse of Orchard House, she saw her mother waving a handkerchief. May, along with Julian Hawthorne, escorted Louisa to the Concord train station. Louisa rode to Boston, where she spent one last civilian night with her cousin, Lizzie Wells. Friday was, if possible, more frantic than Thursday had been. Always eager to economize, Louisa scoured Boston to obtain the free rail pass to which her military appointment entitled her. Each official referred her to another, usually in some building on the side of town from which she had just come. She crossed and recrossed the city, clashing with languid and indifferent bureaucrats, seemingly intent on denying her the essential documents. She got the last of her papers in order just in time to join Anna and her husband for a hasty farewell dinner. The couple accompanied Louisa to the station so that theirs might be the last in a series of numbing goodbyes. The sun in that dark season had already faded as Louisa sank into her seat on the train. Abruptly, after 2 days of furious bustle, hours of empty time lay ahead of her. Time to check over her tickets, put them in a safe place, then lose and rediscover them again. Time to count the small funds some family friends had given her to buy necessities for herself and modest gifts for her patients. She had time to gaze out onto the darkening landscape as the city gave way to open fields. Feeling lonely, she let her seatmate draw her into a long conversation about, quote, the war, the weather, music, Carlisle, skating, genius, hoops, and the immortality of the soul, unquote. Any topic was fine, as long as it kept away the blues. The train did not take Louisa directly to Washington. In New London, Connecticut, she transferred to a steamship which carried her through the night to New Jersey. A rank novice at seafaring, she spent a wide-eyed night imagining that the boat was about to sink and wondering how she would save herself if it did. When, to her mild astonishment, the boat landed safely in Jersey City, she made her way to the train for Washington. Although the places through which she passed were unknown to her, they evoked clear emotions. As the train puffed its way through Philadelphia, Louisa regretted that she did not have time to stop and seek out her birthplace in Germantown. In Baltimore, her train passed not far from the spot where, 2 springs before, a mob of Southern sympathizers had attacked the 6th Massachusetts Regiment on its way to Washington. As she remembered the riot, Louisa's temper rose as if the assault had just happened, and she felt, quote, as if I should enjoy throwing a stone at somebody. Hard. Let me just check here, and I don't know how I am for time. I've got, okay, because I've got like 12 more pages in this. Okay, great. Louisa's journey ended as it had begun in early evening. As her hired carriage drew her through the streets toward Georgetown, she caught her first glimpse of the unfinished Capitol dome and gazed in wonder at the White House. On her arrival at the Union Hotel Hospital, she received the welcome of Mrs. Hannah Rose, the hospital matron. The kindly woman noted Louisa's arrival in her journal that night. Quote, we are cheered by the arrival of Miss Alcott from Concord, the prospect of a really good nurse, a gentlewoman who can do more than merely keep the patients from falling out of bed. All through the time of Louisa's journey, quite unknown to her, events had been unfolding in a fatefully simultaneous fashion. The new commander of Lincoln's Army of the Potomac, Ambrose Burnside, had decided to attempt a strike against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia before the coming winter would bring a pause to significant maneuvers. On December 11th, the very day that Louisa received her orders, Burnside's engineers were hastily laying pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River, and the Army of the Potomac prepared to cross into the evacuated town of Fredericksburg. The next day, as Louisa scoured Boston in search of an official to authorize her train pass, Union soldiers vandalized the Virginia town, smashing china and wrecking furniture. That night, as Louisa's train plunged into the night south of Boston, blue-coated amateur musicians played raucous versions of patriotic tunes on pianos that had been dragged into the streets of Fredericksburg, and officers gazed anxiously up at the strongly fortified Confederate positions above the town, wondering if Burnside's battle plan would lead to victory. Their worst doubts were confirmed the next day. On the damp, leaden Saturday afternoon of December 13, 1862, while Louisa's train was steaming through Pennsylvania and Maryland, Burnside sent 14 separate brigades up the sloping hillside known as Marie's Heights. Near the top was a stone wall. Behind it, an entire corps of Lee's army. I say Louisa every time something starts with L. Behind it, an entire corps of Lee's army lay waiting. When the rebels opened fire, their fusillade was as thick and rapid as machine gun fire. Of the thousands who answered the order to charge, not a single Union soldier came within 30 yards of the wall. Using a strangely placid simile, Union Corps Commander Darius Couch later described watching the brigades, quote, melt like snow coming down on warm ground, unquote. After nightfall in Georgetown, Louisa first turned down the blankets in her upstairs room at the Union Hotel Hospital. 40 miles to the southwest, on the sloping ground above Fredericksburg, the bitterly cold air was filled with the despairing cries of literally thousands of wounded men. Louisa had completed her journey to Union Hotel Hospital. For many of the Fredericksburg wounded, a journey to the same destination was about to begin. Louisa wrote a mildly fictionalized version of her time as an Army nurse, a short book called Hospital Sketches, that she published within months of returning from service. Shying away from overt autobiography, Louisa dispensed with her real name in Hospital Sketches, adopting the alias of, anybody, trivia?
Tribulation Periwinkle.
Outstanding, yes, Tribulation Periwinkle. Despite the superficial camouflage, however, Hospital Sketches was a virtually true account. Not only did Louisa assemble the manuscript while her recollections were fresh, but her principal source material was unimpeachable. According to Clara Gowing, an Alcott family friend, all but a few of the narrative's passages were taken directly from the letters, now lost, that Louisa had sent home to her parents. One particular in which Hospital Sketches varies from the truth is in its narrator's denial of any deeply felt motivation to join the cause. Miss Periwinkle decides to take up nursing only because she wants, quote, something to do, unquote. And going off to tend to wounded soldiers is only one of the possibilities suggested by her well-meaning relations. Louisa, to the contrary, ached to have a part in the war from its outset, and military nursing appealed both to her maternal instinct and her love of a good fight. In a dispatch written for the New York Times, Walt Whitman observed that, quote, a benevolent person with the right qualities intact cannot perhaps make a better investment of himself at present anywhere upon the varied surface of this whole big world than in these military hospitals, unquote. Coincidentally, Whitman's own first personal encounter with war also came on the heels of Fredericksburg. What he saw nauseated him. Quote, here in the hospitals, he wrote, I am present at the most appalling things. Hours afterward, I feel sick and actually tremble when I recall the thing and have it in my mind again. Unquote. Although Louisa reported for duty at her hospital on the day of the battle, 4 days went by before the first of the wounded began to arrive. During that brief period of grace, Louisa settled in and began to acquaint herself with her new tasks. Even before the flood of wounded arrived from Fredericksburg, she had a great deal of work to do. In between major engagements, the hospitals were kept busy administering to soldiers who had been felled by disease. Louisa reported that she was surrounded by, quote, pneumonia on one side, diphtheria on the other, and 5 typhoids on the opposite. Moreover, only 3 months had gone by since the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest one-day battle of the war, and a number of casualties from that battle were yet to be discharged. During Louisa's first morning, a soldier died before her eyes. Not much later, she learned that one of the nurses in charge of a ward of patients had departed without leave. Despite her inexperience, Louisa was immediately entrusted with the supervision of 40 beds, incongruously located in an erstwhile ballroom. She washed faces, dispensed medicines, and tried to look as professional and competent as possible as she and the other nurses awaited the wounded from the recent battle. One of Louisa's first patients was, in her description, quote, a boy with pneumonia. She sat with him all day, and in a gesture both kind and symbolic, placed her mother's shawl around the young man as he sat up, fighting for breath. When he smiled at her and said, quote, you are real motherly, ma'am, quote, she felt for the first time as if she were getting on. She hoped that she looked motherly to all the men in the ward, for she wrote, quote, my 30 years made me feel old, and the suffering round me made me long to comfort everyone. Louisa's work began in earnest on the morning of December 17th, when an African-American boy, in an excited tone that might have been mistaken for joy, cried out, they's coming in, I tell you, heaps on. The rest of the day was a baffling swirl of sensations, unspeakable odors, the sight of men without arms and legs, the sound of heavy feet, and the urgent shouts of doctors, nurses, and orderlies. Louisa noticed, however, that one sound was surprisingly absent from the general uproar. Scarcely a cry of pain went up from the men, no matter how grotesquely they had been wounded. Louisa had often longed to groan for them, quote, when pride kept their white lips shut, while great drops stood on their foreheads, and the bed shook with the irrepressible tremor of their tortured bodies. Her first weapons in her war to save the Union were a sponge, a basin, and a bar of brown soap. Removing the dirt from the endless stream of wounded consumed the first part of the day. When the scrubbing and rinsing were done, Louisa and the other nurses dispensed bread, soup, meat, and coffee to all who were well enough to eat. One man, his right arm too shattered to save, struggled to write a letter to a girlfriend with his left. Another, shot through the stomach, asked for water. By the time Louisa was able to find a cup for him, he was dead. There was little time, however, to reflect on any individual tragedy. Until 11 that night, Louisa did whatever she could do to comfort her charges, mopping feverish faces, smoothing rumpled beds, and even singing lullabies. The days that followed arranged themselves into a routine constant enough that Louisa was able to describe a typical day in her journal. It began at 6, when she rose and dressed by gaslight. She then risked the fury of the men in her ward by throwing open the windows to admit the frigid winter air. Much as she understood their objections to the chill, she was convinced that the alternative was worse. When the windows were closed, the room received almost no ventilation, and Louisa was terrified that the absence of fresh air would turn the room into a more lethal pestilence box than it already was. Despite her best efforts, it remained a dirty, damp place where the odors of wounds, stables, kitchens, and washrooms perniciously mingled. As a futile defense against them, she carried a bottle of lavender water, whose contents she liberally scattered. She poked up the fires, laid the blankets where they were needed, and lightened the atmosphere as best she could with joking and conversation. Her breakfast would have sent a devoted Fruitlander into spasms. It was an unchanging menu of fried beef, bread with salted water, and coffee that she described as washy. The discussions around the table added no seasoning to the heavy, unappetizing fare. Louisa found most of her colleagues either bland or pompously opinionated, and it was all she could do to keep from laughing aloud at their ill-tutored arrogance. After breakfast, she could be found doing any of a dozen things, almost simultaneously. She gave out rations and washed faces, she dusted tables and chased after supplies. She sewed bandages, dispensed medicine, and changed dressings. She was perpetually nettled by the incompetence of the attendants she supervised, who even needed to be shown how to sweep a floor and make a bed. Her daily battle with, quote, disorder, discomfort, and bad management eased a bit after the midday meal, when she took time to write letters for the soldiers who could not write for themselves. The duty she found hardest was answering letters that had come from men who had not lived to receive them. Newspapers, gossip, and the evening medicinal doses occupied her colleagues during the relatively unhurried hours after supper. When time permitted, Louisa read to the soldiers from the Dickens novels that she had brought with her for that purpose. The day typically ended at 9, when a bell sounded the call for lights out. The evenings, however, were not all the same, thanks to Dr. John Winslow, the recently appointed surgeon on Louisa's ward. Dr. John, as he permitted Louisa to call him, quoted freely from Browning and often came to her room to share a few selections from his portable library. He went for walks with her when time allowed and took her to the Capitol to hear the House chaplain read a somewhat flowery sermon, followed by dinner at a German restaurant. Dr. Winslow seems to have had more than friendship on his mind, and Louisa observed with a tingling awareness that her companion, quote, is given to confidences in the twilight, and altogether is amiably amusing, and exceedingly, last word, italicized, young. The emphasis on the last word was Louisa's. What might have happened, either for good or ill, if she had been more receptive to the young doctor's attentions, is a matter of entertaining speculation. However, restraint and propriety won out. The good doctor invited Louisa to his room, and she did not go. The fortunes of another John possessed a more powerful, though decidedly unromantic hold on Louisa's heart. His full name was John Surrey. I never know how to pronounce that. Is it Sura or Surrey? I'm going to go with Surrey. A blacksmith from Virginia who had come to the hospital gravely wounded. Unmarried and 28 years old when the war began, Surrey had remained loyal to the Union when his state had seceded. However, he had not been able to join the army as soon as he would have liked, for he was responsible for the welfare of his widowed mother and younger siblings. Their needs had kept him from marrying, but enlisting posed a harder question. Enlisting, he had reasoned, meant helping his neighbor, whereas marriage would have meant only pleasing himself. For a long time, he had weighed his obligations to family against his duty to country, until the day when his mother decided the issue by pressing a keepsake ring into his hand and saying, "Go." Fredericksburg had been his first battle. A rebel bullet had pierced his left lung and broken a rib, so that every breath stabbed him like a knife. Although he did not know it, he was beyond saving. Louisa was sent to tell him so because the surgeon in charge of his case did not have the heart to deliver the message himself. John impressed her with his quiet courage and simple morality. She later wrote, quote, "The army needed men like John, earnest, brave, and faithful, fighting for liberty and justice with both heart and hand, true soldiers of the Lord," unquote. For all his pain, John gave almost no outward sign of distress, and Louisa was surprised when the surgeon told her that, of all the patients in the ward, he suffered the most. Even the blacksmith had a limit, though. Her news still undelivered, Louisa noticed that great silent tears were rolling from his eyes. Louisa described what followed. "Straightway my fear vanished. My heart opened wide and took him in, as, gathering the bent head in my arms, as freely as if he had been a little child, I said, 'Let me help you bear it, John.' Never on any human countenance have I seen so swift and beautiful a look of gratitude, surprise, and comfort as that which answered me more eloquently than the whispered, 'Thank you, ma'am. This is right good. This is what I wanted.'" Of all the moments that influenced Louisa's thinking about human relationships, none was more important than this. It exemplified what she came to see as the greatest good in life, the sweetness of sharing another's adversity. In much of her best fiction, emotional climaxes occur when central female characters offer to share the burdens of those they love. Orchid heroines tend to interpret times of challenge as opportunities to transcend selfishness. These opportunities are almost always accepted. John Surrey died only 2 days after Louisa offered to share his suffering. To the end, he remained a model of quiet fortitude, crying out only once in bitter agony, "For God's sake, give me air." Louisa held his hand as the end came. He grasped her hand so tightly that his fingers left 4 white marks on the back of it. As when she had lost her sister Lizzie, Louisa reflected on the idea of death as a welcome friend and healer. In hospital sketches, she was to write of death as, quote, "the diviner brother," unquote, of sleep, and as, quote, a better nurse than I, who healed with a touch, unquote. Observing Surrey's peaceful expression, Louisa imagined that his half-hour's acquaintance with death had made friends of the two. Many sentimental writers of Louisa's time sought to ease the pain of loss by making death sound sweet and good. In Louisa's hands, however, this device never sounds false or maudlin. She had, it seems, a strength of mind and an inner stoicism that truly shielded her from a fear of dying. To her, the idea of death as holy healer was entirely plausible. In this atmosphere of suffering and death, Louisa's reflections turned to the memory of another lost hero, the recently departed Thoreau. In Concord, at the actual time of his passing, she had borne the event more or less silently. Now, with the benefit of a little time and distance, she found a voice for her feelings. One night, as she kept watch over a dying soldier, Louisa reached for a piece of paper. By the end of her watch, she had finished her best-remembered poem, Thoreau's Flute. The poem begins with a somber lament of her mentor's death, but the mood changes as miraculously the wind blows through the dead man's flute, playing a song of hope. Then from the flute, untouched by hands, there came a low, harmonious breath. For such as he, there is no death. His life, the eternal life, commands. Above man's aims, his nature rose. The wisdom of a just content made one small spot a continent and turned to poetry life's prose. Louisa spun her lyric around the interweaving of two spirits, the soul of her departed friend and the wind that wafted through the flute he had left behind. The flute seems a humble medium between this world and the next, translating the wind with which Thoreau's soul was now merged into the words that glorify his memory. Once a voice on behalf of nature, Thoreau's voice is now one with nature. The breath that no longer fills his consumptive lungs still carries its message of peace to those sensitive enough to hear it. Hardly thinking she had written the finest poem she would ever write, Louisa put it away and did not remember it until months later. More urgent matters now filled her mind. Subjected to overwork, rewarded by an inadequate diet, and constantly exposed to life-threatening disease, a nurse in a Civil War hospital could wear out quickly. With some exaggeration, Louisa claimed never to have had a sick day in her life before starting her nursing career. Nevertheless, she began coughing as soon as she arrived at the hospital, a symptom that the matron initially dismissed as a sympathetic reaction to the maladies of her patients. However, Louisa was in danger of becoming one of those nurses who, to use her own description, quote, sometimes in their sympathy forget that they are mortal and run the risk of being made immortal sooner than is agreeable to their partial friends. Less than 3 weeks after her arrival, Louisa was already beginning to lose her strength. Perhaps irritated by her perceived weakness, she refused to slacken her pace. She persisted in starting each day with a brisk run. Her colleagues warned that she was driving herself too hard and predicted that she would soon develop pneumonia. She ignored them. Before I drive myself too hard, I'm going to take a quaff of some Poland Spring. I'll be right back with you. On New Year's Eve, Louisa's spirits received a welcome boost, for at midnight the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. She lay awake in her plain, drafty room until midnight, when church bells throughout the city rang in the new year, as well as the other more portentous beginning. Much to the annoyance of her more politically detached roommate, she danced from her bed and threw open the window. With a voice already weakened by disease, she cheered feebly and waved her handkerchief at a group of black men who were celebrating in the street below. Throughout the night, Louisa recalled, the black population of Georgetown, quote, tooted and tramped, cracked firecrackers, sang glory hallelujah, and took comfort, poor souls, in their own way, unquote. During her brief stint at the hospital, nothing gave Louisa more satisfaction than the sights and sounds of that night of freedom. On the home front, too, Bronson celebrated Lincoln's proclamation. He pasted a copy of the document in his journal, and on New Year's Day he attended an emancipation meeting at the Tremont Temple in Boston, where he observed, quote, the black men have the eloquence and carry the meeting as they ought, unquote. A week later, the Alcotts received a letter from Louisa giving lively descriptions of her work at the hospital. Bronson's reaction to her words mingled pride with concern. He wrote, quote, "She seems active and interested, and if her strength is adequate to the task, could not better serve herself or the country. But I fear this will end in her breaking down presently." Not realizing how accurately he had judged the case, Bronson agreed to give a series of 4 conversations, arranged by Emerson and Dudley Bradford, to commence at Temperance Hall on January 19th. The titles dealt in broad generalities: nature, politics, letters, and religion. However, the brief parenthetical descriptions he added in his journal suggest an interesting approach to the material. Beside each of the first 3 subjects, Bronson listed a series of names. Nature was to be typified by Thoreau, Agassiz, and Goethe. Politics would be a discussion of William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and John Brown. And letters would treat Emerson and Hawthorne. Alcott had borrowed the idea of using particular men to personify concepts from Carlyle and Emerson. What was significant, however, was that, with the sole exception of Goethe, Bronson was confining himself to people he had personally known. At the age of 62, Bronson was becoming more concerned with lived experience, coming to see that personality and biography might not only embody larger ideas, but might matter as much as the ideas themselves. Just as importantly, he was starting to understand how greatly his life had been shaped by his friendships. This realization would yield finer fruit as the years passed. The breakdown that Bronson feared for Louisa was not long in coming. There was a sudden lapse in the steady stream of letters she sent home. Disturbed by the silence, Julie and Hawthorne began stopping by Orchard House regularly in hopes of news. Pale and sad, Abba could only shake her head. Louisa herself had been the last to admit that she was on the verge of collapse, and she had struggled on as long as she could. On January 9th, the hospital matron wrote that both she and Louisa were ill and suffering terribly, but that, despite their condition, they had worked together on 3 dying men and saved all of them. She called Louisa, quote, "a splendid young woman," but she was not invincible. One morning, Louisa's head felt like a cannonball and her feet seemed glued to the floor. Half aware of the anxious voices and expressions around her, she staggered upstairs to bed. For some days afterward, she was still able to walk downstairs to take meals. Eventually, even this exertion became too much for her. Louisa's fellow nurses, too busy for politeness and pleasantries, had previously struck her as remote and unfriendly. Now that she was ill, however, she found herself surrounded by care and kindness. A healthy colleague was taken for granted, but an ailing one received all the respect and attention that was due the stricken comrade in arms. The attendants from Louisa's ward regularly climbed the stairs to fill her wood box and to bring progress reports and hand-fashioned presents from her patients below. Dr. Winslow now came to her room not as a potential beau, but as a worried physician. He haunted her room, she said, bringing the things she needed and acting in general, quote, like a motherly little man as he is, unquote. Several of the nurses visited each evening with food and conversation. Louisa found herself, quote, so be-tea'd and be-toasted, petted and served, that she was quite in the lap of luxury. However, she still preferred doing to having things done for her. And even after she was confined to her room, she continued to do sewing for the men. She still had 2 months to go before her orders expired, and she was determined not only to serve the time, but to fill it with as much usefulness as her condition would allow. But that condition was worsening each day. The doctors now had a firm diagnosis: typhoid pneumonia. Her cough became more persistent, and her body no longer seemed to belong to her. Her perceptions became jumbled, and fact and hallucination began to mingle. Louisa remembered, quote, hours began to get confused, people looked odd, queer faces haunted the room, and the nights were one long fight with weariness and pain, unquote. On the morning of January 14th, the Alcotts received a wire from the hospital matron. Mrs. Ropes, her own health failing as fast as Louisa's, wrote that Louisa's service as a nurse could no longer continue. Someone must come for her, and come quickly. Bronson wasted no time. He canceled his conversation engagement and caught the noon train, traveling along the same tracks that Louisa had ridden only 6 weeks before. The passage to Jersey City was slowed by fog, and he spent helpless hours waiting for the weather to clear. From Jersey City, he took the evening train and rode all night to reach Georgetown. On the morning of the 16th, when he was led to Louisa's room, his eyes fell on a shocking tableau. The wind whistled in through 5 broken window panes that no one in the hospital had had time to repair. Rats could be heard scuttling in the walls. A virtually opaque mirror, a blue pitcher, a tin basin, and a pair of yellow mugs comprised the toilet accessories. There, on a thin mattress laid on a stark iron bed, lay Louisa. She was able to recognize the, quote, gray-headed gentleman who rose like a ghost, unquote, above her, but she was barely recognizable herself. She was thin and weak. The normally robust color of her cheeks had given way to a wraith-like pallor. Bronson's ability to suppress his emotions had often annoyed and frustrated people, Louisa included, but now it was for the best. Whatever anguish he felt, he tried not to show. All that Louisa recalled his saying at that moment was, "Come home." Louisa had resisted every other voice that had told her to quit, but now the simple summons of her father signaled to her that the fight was over. At the sight of him, she wrote, "My resolution melted away, and my heart turned traitor to my boys. I answered, 'Yes, Father.'" With his 2 simple words, Bronson released Louisa from much more than her obligations to the hospital. All her life, she had hoped to please her father. Sometimes she had clearly disappointed him. On other occasions, he had given approval, but seldom as she had hoped he would. Almost always, it had seemed, more was expected. Now, however, she finally knew that it was all right. She had done enough. 5 days passed before Louisa could be taken home. Her doctors believed that she was too weak to be moved. Although he did not see how his daughter could grow stronger by staying where she was, Bronson reluctantly agreed to wait. Having already heard about some of Louisa's patients in her letters, he satisfied his curiosity by walking around the ward and seeing them. The experience left him with few words. "Horrid war," he wrote, "and one sees its horrors in hospitals, if anywhere." As a matter of hospital policy, parents of the sick and wounded were discouraged from spending too much time with their children, so despite his concern, Bronson was not permitted to stay with Louisa. Leaving her to the care of his fellow nurses, Bronson took a few hours to have a look around Washington. Like his daughter, a few weeks earlier, he went to the Senate chamber, where, by a wonderful coincidence, President Lincoln was in attendance. Alcott sat near him. In recording his brief encounter with the chief executive, Alcott remarked on his honest bearings and strong face, quote, "more comely than the papers and portraits have shown him," unquote. He added tersely that Lincoln's, quote, "behavior was good," unquote. In those days, personal access even to the highest elected officials was freer than one can easily imagine today. It was by no means out of the question for Bronson to obtain a meeting with the great man. Bronson mused for a while on his chance of a lifetime, but he wisely rejected it. He wrote, quote, "I have wished to have had an interview, but am too anxious about Louisa and without time to seek it," unquote. Any disagreements about whether Louisa should be promptly taken home were settled in tragic fashion on January 20th, when the matron, Mrs. Ropes, died. The doctors consented at once to Louisa's departure, but heavy rains prevented any movement until the following day. Dorothea Dix herself appeared at the train station to see Louisa off and present her with gifts. Bronson, who had more pressing matters on his mind, vaguely described them as, quote, "good things for Louisa's comfort," unquote. They traveled all day and through the night. On the evening of January 22nd, they arrived in Boston too late to catch the train for Concord. They spent the night with relatives of Abbott. By the time they reached Orchard House the next day, Louisa was not in her right mind. She had the impression that the house had lost its roof and that no one there wanted to see her. The exhaustion and illness of the previous 6 weeks had changed her so profoundly that Sophia Hawthorne said she would not have recognized her. For his part, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote to his publisher that the fever looked very threatening and that he feared she would not pull through. Lying in her great mahogany sleigh bed, barely conscious of the anxious stir around her, Louisa spent the next 2 days adrift between sleep and delirium. In a journal entry describing her journey to Georgetown, Louisa had called the moment, quote, "a solemn time, but I'm glad to live in it, and I'm sure it will do me good whether I come out alive or dead," unquote. She very nearly had come out dead, but she also had lived more intensely and with more visible purpose than she ever had before. But as Dr. Bartlett made his daily visits and her family hoped for the best, it was not clear that she would live to turn her experiences and her purpose to account. I think that's... So I will leave the concluding pages, I think, for you to read for yourselves. But anyway, I hope you'll enjoy it. The floor's open. Yes.
What criteria did she need to become a nurse?
What criteria did she need
I
to become a
understood she
nurse?
needed 3 dark dresses and she could find those, but
Okay.
did she need some training or?
My goodness, well, you know, she felt that she had had pretty good training as a nurse during Lizzie's illness, and so she felt prepared from that point of view. It sounds to me, you know, from reading the descriptions written by the hospital matron, that they were eager to get, you know, women of good social standing who could generally be depended upon. But she was thrown in the deep end and just had to go with it. So there was the age requirement of 30 to sort of screen out the simpering young romantics. But apart from that, I think the Union Army was as desperate for nurses as they were for foot soldiers. So that's my impression. Yes?
Started to write a book.
What
You're
is-
a lawyer. Teaching something different.
Okay, well, it's a very long story, which I'll condense for you. Maybe I can answer it in 2 parts. First of all, maybe how I got from law to literature. I decided to be a lawyer when I was about 12 years old. I had this very clear but grandiose idea in my mind that I was going to be president of the United States. And so I read some biographies and realized, well, more presidents have been lawyers and generals than anything else. I didn't want to get shot at, so I figured that lawyer was a better way to go. And that was all of the real reflection that I put into it. And I got to law school and I realized, oh my gosh, this isn't what I thought it was at all. Fortunately, my last year in law school, I had some credits to fill that I did not have to fill in law courses. So I instead took some graduate level seminars in the Harvard English department from Sack Van Berkovich and Robert Kiley. And it was Sack Van Berkovich who really sort of gave me the bug. At that point, of course, I'd thrown 3 years and lots of my family's money into going to law school. So it's like a military commitment. You have to do more to justify what you've already done. So I practiced until 1991, and then just had done with it. I got married the same year that I left the law, thus driving my in-laws to utter distraction. They thought that they were getting a lawyer in the family, and they were getting a grad student. In fact, when I first started working at John Jay, one of the older professors gave a reception at her very posh West Side apartment for the new hires, and her husband was a lawyer. And I came up to her, thanked her for the party, and admired the beautiful apartment. And she said, "Well, you have to understand, I married a lawyer." And my comeback was, "Yeah, my wife tried that. It didn't work out for me." So anyway, but then I just I realized over time that it's important not to chase money to the exclusion of everything else, and to follow one's bliss. And this is the stupid part. It was about the time that the movie Field of Dreams came out. And it just caught me at a sort of vulnerable, sentimental moment. And I thought to myself, well, how many people really do hear those voices that tell them to build their ball field? And my ball field was to become a professor and to read good books and talk and write about them. And so I just decided I would throw caution to the winds. And so here I am. But the other part of your question, how did I decide to write this book? Also a curious story. I had written an article for New England Quarterly back in 2001. About a week or so after it came out, I got a call from nowhere, from a literary agent. He said, "I've read your article. Can I represent you for a nonfiction book?" I said, "Let me think for a second." "Yes, absolutely." Initially, we thought about writing a book on 19th century utopias. As somebody who leaves a law firm for grad school is pretty utopian to begin with. But I started with the research on the Utopia book. I got 2 weeks into it. The first thing I researched was Fruitlands. And I said, I don't want to write a sort of general book about utopias. I want to write about this father and daughter. Because at that time, my daughter was 7.5. She had been born when I was in graduate school, and because my wife works, I was really the hands-on parent. And so I knew something about what it was like to be like Bronson, very present with a young child and really responsible for the child's unfolding education. And I thought, this could be a wonderful opportunity because my life experience will help to show me how to write this book. And the book, I hope, will show me how to be a more sensitive, better father. And in fact, that is how it has worked out. And so the two proudest things of my life, you've heard a few pages from one of them, and the other one is at summer camp. So, and I wish she could be here. She was here last year, as some of you know.
And she's wonderful. She is.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, yeah.
Did Alcott ever comment on Walt Whitman? Did they know each other?
Yes, they did. In fact, Alcott was present when Whitman and Thoreau met in New York City in, I believe, 1857. I might be off slightly there. It might be 1856. I can't remember off the top of my head. But in fact, the best account that we have of the initial meeting between Thoreau and Whitman is from Alcott's journal. And in fact, Alcott responded very sympathetically to Whitman, but Thoreau kept his distance. They seemed to be sort of, I think Alcott describes it as almost being like two unfamiliar dogs sort of sniffing each other and trying to figure out. I can't remember exactly, don't quote me. But so Alcott got to know Whitman very shortly after what would have been, I guess, the second edition of Leaves of Grass. And then also there's a story of how, and there may be other meetings, but there's also a story of how Whitman came to Concord when Emerson was in failing health, 1881 or even possibly 82. And it's a very sort of emotive moment because Emerson at that point is really not Emerson anymore, and all he can really do is sit and smile. And Whitman, to that time, still remains very overpowered by the presence of Emerson and Alcott. In spite of all of his seemingly boundless self-confidence that you get from his poetry, Whitman was not a completely self-confident man, and felt, at a sort of lower rung from Emerson and Alcott, even when Emerson and Alcott were in their late 70s.
Did Louisa May Alcott comment on that meeting?
I can't pull out of my mind anything that she says about Whitman, actually. So
She was present though at
She was there?
at that reading.
Okay.
I think she was the only woman there. I mean,
Okay.
it was post-Calamus, and he was a little tainted. There was a little whiff about him. Women didn't come to that reading, but Louisa was there, which I think is really impressive.
Okay. So there you go. Yeah.
Can you share the gems or treasures you discovered in your research of these two authors?
The gems and treasures. Well, one of them is the illustration that I spoke about of the family leaving Fruitlands, which I had never seen before anywhere. There's another visual treasure that I use as the frontispiece of this book, which is a page from one of Bronson's journals. In addition to writing copious journals about himself, he also kept very detailed journals on the infancies and early youth of his first three daughters. And there is a page in which he has traced the outline of his hand and then has superimposed the tracing of Louisa's hand with it. So that's lovely. In terms of the things that I've discovered of a sort of verbal nature, I have a deep attachment, in particular, to those childhood journals, the observations on the spiritual nurture of his children, that Alcott began in 1831 with Anna's birth and continued through their, what we would now call their preschool years. And I'm hoping that as a follow-up project, I can interest someone in bringing out an edition of those journals, because I think that they have just multiple value for child psychologists, for historians of transcendentalism. And my goodness, who knew that Louisa was going to grow up to be a world-famous author? And we have these journals telling us, when she bopped Anna on the head and things like that. So it's just really, it's really perfect. But there have been revelations all over the place. And as I'm sure everyone in this room who's been to Houghton Library will corroborate, you can never write the definitive book on the Alcotts, because there is so much there. Bronson's surviving journals begin in 1826 and they span until 1882. And they kept scrapbooks and family collections, and you've got just letters and journals galore. I hope that no one who reads this book will find that it is overly long, but it is 22% shorter than my initial manuscript. I wanted to get so much into this, and my editor said, "Sorry, you've got to cut it down." So I went through each chapter, saying, "Well, I have to cut 22% here," judiciously, of course. And I think it is actually a better read now. But it's absolutely unending.
Any surprises in their relationship?
Surprises in their relationship. Yeah, absolutely. Because the relationship that we typically understand is, informed by people like Martha Saxton, who had not a good thing to say about Bronson. And one discovers that her research was extraordinarily selective, and that she absolutely must have read documents that mitigate that portrayal, but chose not to include them. And I disclosed that one of my motivations was to write a book about a father and a daughter, and so I began sort of from a predisposition to be sympathetic to Bronson. That predisposition can only go a certain length, because there are things that are just outrageous about it. But what I was able to discover was that his relationship with her changes over time, that there are times when she appalls and frustrates him, but as time goes by, he begins to understand the unique value that she has, and particularly after the episode that I've described. Bronson Alcott valued nothing in the world so much as sacrifice. And when he saw that his daughter had very, very nearly had paid the full price, what Lincoln would call the full measure of devotion, so far as I can tell, his criticism absolutely stops. The sonnet that he writes to her in Sonnets and Canzonets is particularly about her Civil War service, as was mentioned yesterday. She does become for him duty's faithful child, and not just because of everything that she did for him and the family. The other thing, it's a wonderful question, so I want to dignify it with a full response. People always seem to come away with the impression that Anna and Lizzie were more his favorites than Louisa. There is some basis for understanding that. However, if one looks at the diaries of the children's spiritual nurture, he also observes that Anna is very sensitive to criticism, that when he tries to correct her, she just seems to shrink and shrivel. Whereas Louisa from the beginning is much more assertive and confident. And he writes in these journals, look, I have to pursue two different strategies of parenting with these two children, because one of them I can seemingly kill with a glance, but the other one really needs a very firm hand. As far as I can tell, he was correct. So anyway, that to me was a revelation. Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, I appreciate your appreciation of Bronson, and of course I had Martha Saxon, so no problem there. But I'm curious.
Yeah.
There are lots of other scholars, most of whom I'm sure you know as well as I do, who don't have your
Yeah.
appreciation of Bronson.
Sure.
Particularly about the childhood journals. Charles Strickland, a long time ago,
Yeah.
he found Bronson's childhood journals appalling, and found him manipulative. We all know Bronson says
Sure.
childhood hath saved me.
Yeah.
And that can be interpreted, as you know, one of two ways. Positively, or that he used his children and
Yeah.
used everybody else throughout his life.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about this other side. I mean, it's possible to say that yes, Bronson appreciated Louisa's service in the Civil War and it changed their relationship. I agree.
Yeah.
But it's also possible to say that what happened in that was she was helpless
Yeah.
and dying, and Bronson suddenly had no problem with this tough-minded, talented young woman. He now had women as they should.
Okay. Well.
I'm being nasty here, but my life, that's okay.
Yeah.
It's both ways. And
Sure.
that his later and much pleasanter relationship with her also has a great deal to do with Bronson's sensitivity to what other people think. And certainly Louisa has, as we heard in Dan Shanley's thing, discovered even on her trip to Europe that yes, she is famous. She is a lioness. She didn't like it, but there it is. And it made Bronson's career. And he says so himself.
Sure.
He now goes on his trips, and he's the father of Little Women, and he uses this and says this and identifies himself.
And yet, when Bronson goes on his tours to talk about the famous people from Concord, he never, to my knowledge, expressly advertises that he's going to talk about Louisa. Now there are promotional broadsides and so forth that say, but they also misspell his name, so you can't really say that he necessarily had control over those. He made a point, honestly, of never bringing her into his discussions unless he was asked to, and then he would. Of course, he knew full well that he was going to be asked to, so it's a fine distinction. But I don't see him as just selfishly writing for coattails, because he could have done much more.